A man investigating principles cannot argue with one who denies their existence. A quote from the Physics of Aristotle. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. This is the 35th episode of The Greek Sun, a series of podcasts about ancient Greek history. Today's episode returns to the topic of Greek science and also introduces the figure of Aristotle, a student of Plato's Academy. In previous episodes, I made allusions to how philosophy and science were essentially all the same in the ancient world. In fact, philosophy really encompassed all modes of what we would really just call higher learning today, things like literature, science, history, mathematics, and so on. In this and the following episodes of the podcast, I will demonstrate how science and philosophy and other subjects of study were all considered in some way together in this time period, but they were already beginning to branch off into different directions. Now, Aristotle, in terms of his impact on history, was probably the most significant thinker of all time. I know that's a pretty powerful statement, and some of you might immediately disagree, but ongoing episodes will demonstrate that, like him or not, no one had a bigger influence for a longer period of time on Western thought from his own time through to the end of the Middle Ages anyway, and he continues to have academic descendants in our own time. While there are obviously many important thinkers and scientists in our own time, none of them has yet had the eon-spanning influence that Aristotle, for better or worse, had on the West for over 1,000 years. Now, before we begin the next segment, please remember to check out the website if you're not already there. You can support this podcast in a number of ways. You can like, share, and subscribe on whatever platform you listen to, and don't forget to check out my YouTube channel, which you can just find under the name Western Traditions Podcast. You can also buy merchandise at the website or support my work directly through PayPal or Patreon. Patreon supporters have access to a weekly newsletter about podcast news, about behind-the-scenes work and upcoming episodes. Patreon supporters can also ask questions that I will answer in future newsletters. The life of Aristotle marks a turning point in Western history in more ways than one. Right away, we should note that he is the first figure that we study about whom we know certain facts. Even through the time of Socrates and Plato, such models of rationalism, even though in their time we are still dealing with legends in some respect. When we read Herodotus, when we read him several episodes ago, we're no longer reading something semi-mythological like the Odyssey, but we're still reading about ghosts and visions in those works. Exact locations in the works of Herodotus were roughly guessed at, and as for birth dates of the major players in the Persian War, no one was really sure. By the time of Thucydides and Plato, later that century, legends have started to fade from historical writing, but things are still kind of fuzzy. Socrates himself, well, I feel certain he existed, Socrates himself is semi-mythical. The details of his life are almost completely unknown. The life of his disciple Plato is a little more filled out, but still remains mysterious in many regards. With Aristotle, on the other hand, we have more data about the man. We know the years of his birth and death. We know where he was born, where he lived, and with whom he was associated, and so on. No doubt there are many things that we would love to continue discovering about the man. For instance, the details about his own studies and the lectures that he gave as he matured as a philosopher at the Academy in Athens, and the content of all the work he published in his lifetime, things which may be forever lost to us in the maelstrom of history. But compared to any modern historical figure, very little is known about Aristotle. Still, with this ancient philosopher, we're on comparatively much firmer ground in terms of what we can say about his life. Aristotle was born in 384 BC in Stagira, a Greek city founded by Ionian colonists in ages past in the northern stretches of mainland Greece on the eastern course of Chalcidice. If you look at a map, Chalcidice is the odd-looking peninsula on the northwest shores of the Aegean Sea, the one with 3 promontories extending out into the waters. Xerxes had cut a canal through one of these promontories while transporting his fleet to do battle with the Spartans and the Athenians a century before. As a teenager, Aristotle joined Plato's academy in Athens. By then, Plato had acquired quite a following and taught the doctrines of Socrates to many Greeks who traveled from far away to listen to his words. Aristotle remained at the academy for some 20 years, devoting himself to his studies. Around the time of Plato's death, Aristotle left the academy and became the personal tutor for the son of the king of Macedonia, Philip II. The name of this son of Philip, this prince that Aristotle was teaching him? You remember him as Alexander the Great. That's right. Though he probably had no idea at the time, Aristotle would be instrumental in forming the mind of the young man who would soon lead a Greek army to conquer the entire Near East and usher in what we now call the Hellenistic period. By the end of his life, Aristotle's former pupil, Alexander, had conquered much of the civilized world, and Aristotle had lectured a great deal and acquired many of his own disciples. Through the ages since, those disciples and their followers have continued to preserve a number of books whose supposed author is Aristotle, whom Thomas Aquinas simply calls the philosopher, and whom Muslim medieval scholars referred to as the first teacher. While Aristotle did publish works for the general public during his life, it is not believed that any of them survived. This may surprise you if you are already a little familiar with Aristotle, because you may know the names of some of his more famous books, such as the Metaphysics or the Ethics. But through a strange happenstance of history, we believe that most, if not all, of the work that Aristotle wrote for the public has been lost. And the works that we possess today are simply the compilations of his lecture notes and the recollections of his students. As sad as this loss is, this kind of makes sense because the prose in the surviving works, it's not exactly great. This is not fun writing to read. Nevertheless, you hear ancient writers, such as Cicero, the Roman philosopher, writer and statesman, you hear him referring to the writing of Aristotle as a, quote, river of gold. That's probably because Cicero, living more than 2,000 years ago, still had access to the published work of the great philosopher. What we are left with today, though, is probably just a lot of things slapped together and not prepared for public consumption. Now, as we progress through history with this podcast, through the Roman period and into the Middle Ages and beyond, you will come to see how incredibly impactful the works and the thought of Aristotle were, not only for the West, but also for the Islamic world. And it is amazing because it is only the philosopher's notes and the recollections of some of his lectures, compiled into the surviving works that we have today, which are responsible for this massive influence on Western thought. How might things have been different if the entirety of his works had survived the ravages of time? Nevertheless, we have what we have. Aristotle himself was living and teaching in Athens in 323 BC when his former student and supremely powerful patron, Alexander the Great, died in Babylon. Now, Alexander had subjugated Athens and the rest of Greece before heading off to conquer the civilized world, and Athenians being Athenians, as soon as their overlord was dead, they were back to their political wiles. They were ready to throw off the Macedonian yoke. While they were at it, imperial sycophants like Aristotle were suddenly no longer in favor. Like Socrates nearly 80 years before, after a change of power in government, Aristotle was charged with impiety. He was threatened with death, just like Socrates as well. The endangered philosopher fled the city instead of waiting around for a trial. He explained that he did not want to let Athens sin against philosophy a second time. However, the next year Aristotle died on the island of Euboea, off the coast of Attica, and with his death, the history of classical Greece essentially came to a close. The Hellenistic period, in which Greek culture would pour out into the surrounding world as if from a cup overbrimming with wine, this Hellenistic period was already beginning. I will begin our study of Aristotle's work with the Organon, a compilation of 6 treatises which Aristotle wrote about the topic of logic. Now, logic may seem like a weird topic to begin a podcast about Greek science, but as I have stressed before in the beginning, virtually all learning was encompassed by philosophy. And by this I mean that the majority of the quote-unquote subject areas, as we call them, that we study in places like high school or in college, the majority of these academic subjects were all part of the philosopher's focus. Notice that I called them academic subjects. That's what we call them, and that Plato founded an academy, so we call these subjects academic for the most part because they were the sorts of things which came under the philosopher's focus at the academy. The origin of so much knowledge under the umbrella of philosophy is oddly supported by a now well-known online gimmick associated with Wikipedia, the Internet Encyclopedia. If you search any subject online and then go to the Wikipedia article on that subject, and I mean any subject, it could literally be the name of a movie star, if you then click on the first link in the Wikipedia article and continue to click on the first link of every subsequent article that you come to, this link clicking will eventually bring you to the Wikipedia article on philosophy. I mean, this goes for virtually everything. It's true for over 95% of any article that you click on in Wikipedia will eventually lead you back to philosophy. Everything leads back to philosophy because philosophy is not just a lot of arguing about the meaning of life, but it is the source of all desire for learning about anything, really. Now, at the academy in Athens, the aspiring philosophers did not learn things like carpentry or masonry, which were areas of important learning for commoners or slaves, but instead they focused on what we would call quote-unquote book learning, and they became book smart. Now, today we might appreciate a more balanced approach and emphasize the value of trades such as plumbing or construction or even professions like engineering or finance. But the philosophers were interested almost entirely in thinking and in thinking about thought itself. That's worth repeating, thinking about thought itself. And logic is the rightful beginning of study for really any of the academic subjects. Aristotle's logical essays help us to define and agree on first principles. In other words, to find out just what it is we're talking about before we begin to elaborate on it. Now, the first essay in this collection, in the Organon, is called Categories. This text defines terms of supreme importance, especially in the study of philosophy, such as substance, quality, quantity, simple, composite, and more. Here in this tract, we get down to the basement of reality, the bedrock of logic. Aristotle clarifies certain things that you might already assume to be true, but when you study this book, you will be surprised by what you can learn about the things that you already know. Again, that's worth repeating. You can learn a great deal about things that you already know, like how you know them, why they are true, and so on. As you dig into the categories and into other logical treatises by Aristotle, you might feel a little bit like you are getting a grammar lesson, and to some extent you are. That is because grammar is essentially logical. There are a handful of set rules and classifications in any language's grammar, and they define reality for that language. It is a great shame and a great downfall of our culture that grammar is so rarely taught anymore to youth or to anyone for that matter, because to engage with grammar is to learn logic and to learn how to perform logically. The intelligibility of a sentence is dependent entirely on its adherence to a certain type of logic, and to learn grammar is to learn how to think. There is a famous saying that if you cannot write, you cannot think. That is why the curriculum that I've built around the Western traditions is so reliant on writing as a primary form of academic performance. The student that can write intelligently about a subject has more likely than not mastered that subject to some extent. Without a foundation in grammar and logic, it is hardly even possible to argue your way through any idea. You can only make assertions and insist that they are true. In this essay, Categories, Aristotle focuses on the meaning of certain terms which will be used throughout his work, and in the work of many future philosophers. These terms are things like substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, and affection. If you play those words back, and you think about those terms, you can see not only how they may play roles in philosophical discussion, but they are also at the heart of grammar, of the parts of speech. They tell us about action, description, location, and so on. If you spend extra time on any of these portions of Aristotle's categories, you should definitely look at his definition of substance. Substance is a massively important idea in philosophy. It will come up again in this episode when we look at Aristotle's scientific treatise known as Physics. Now, On Interpretation is the title of the second work on logic in the Organon, and here you will directly hear about the parts of speech. He teaches us about nouns and verbs and adjectives. Remember, I said there's a lot of grammar instruction in Aristotle's logic. Now, like with the categories, these are things that you may feel like you already know. And in truth, you can tell that Aristotle truly was building his students' knowledge from the ground up. He was making absolutely sure that the later philosophical discussions to be had were made on solid foundations. But just like all of these elementary documents, I think that if you read them, you might find that you knew less than you think about these primal matters of thought. Now, the next two works in the Organon, the Prior Analytics and the Posterior Analytics, are probably the most read today. In any college class on Aristotle, the text will often include, along with other more famous works, these books, or at least they'll include the Posterior Analytics. But in the Prior Analytics, we learn about syllogisms, that famous teaching tool of Aristotle. Classically presented, a syllogism is composed of 3 lines of connecting and mutually supporting thoughts. An example of a syllogism is the following: every man is an animal, that's line 1. Peter is a man, line 2. And line 3, therefore Peter is an animal. This is deceptively simple, though, and reading the logic of Aristotle requires painstaking study. Just listen to this one short paragraph from the Prior Analytics and understand that Aristotle's work is page after page, book after book of thought this dense. Here's the paragraph. First, take a universal negative with the terms A and B. If no B is A, neither can any A be B. For if some A, let's say C, were B, it would not be true that no B is A, for C is a B. But if every B is A, then some A is B. For if no A were B, then no B could be A. But if we assumed that every B is A, similarly too, if the premise is particular, for if some B is A, then some of the A's must be B. For if none were, then no B would be A. But if some B is not A, there is no necessity that some of the A's should not be B. Let B stand for animal and A for man. Not every animal is a man, but every man is an animal. Now, each little segment of that paragraph really has to be thought through carefully. This is like lifting weights in the gym, but with your mind. It is easy to find yourself mentally exhausted just trying to understand a single page of Aristotle's logic work, not because he's complex, but because he insists on taking apart thought and measuring it out and studying it in the smallest proportions possible and ensuring that each sentence that he speaks is packed with meaning and 100% correct. There is no sloppiness here. Finally, with all this preparation behind you, you can advance to the last 2 books in the Organon, the Topics and the Sophistical Refutations. Here in these volumes, one learns how to argue and how to detect fallacies in argument, among other things. These works were invaluable for generation after generation in preparing the minds of the young elite who would grow up to rule their respective societies in the West. But this episode is about Greek science, and Aristotle did make important contributions to what we would more properly call science today. Previously in this podcast series, I produced an episode about the work of Hippocrates, who was a Greek physician. Now, much of ancient science was devoted to medicine, obviously, because that was the most potentially useful to human beings, finding cures for what ailed them. Now, obviously, also, with things like the pyramids and the beautiful buildings of ancient Athens in mind, we know that things like engineering and architecture were also extremely important sciences for the ancients. Yet, we will find none of that here in Aristotle's work, nor did we hear about it in relation to Plato's Academy or to anything that Socrates ever said, even though Socrates did delve into physical and mathematical ideas with some of his dialogues. But we must remember that for Aristotle and his peers, virtually any type of work involving physical labor, which construction would require, or tanning leather, or making shoes, or playing the flute, or even designing architecture, virtually any such work was mostly considered the realm of slaves and commoners. So the men of quote-unquote higher learning in the academy, whose walls must have required a great deal of learning and knowledge to build, the men discussing science in these buildings possibly would have had no idea how to construct the very edifice which housed them. You might begin to understand now why comedians like Aristophanes were able to ridicule the philosophers with such success. They truly had their heads up in the clouds, while the rest of society was trying to eke out a living from the land and the sea and with the trades that they plied with their very hands. But anyway, medicine, which Hippocrates studied, is really a branch of biology focused on human biology, and Aristotle studied animal biology and wrote quite a bit about it. His biological treatises are titled according to the interesting division of thought that Aristotle, and apparently the ancient Greeks in general, applied to animal science. His treatises on biology are called The History of Animals, On the Parts of Animals, On the Motion of Animals, On the Gait of Animals, and On the Generation of Animals. Yes, there's a book about animal motion and then an entirely separate book focusing on animals' gaits. It sounds unusual, but it makes sense because all animals move, but only some have gaits. That is, only some have legs. A worm does not have a gait, nor does a fish. It's worth reading the text just to learn how Aristotle approached topics from angles that we might not consider as important today. Furthermore, he uses many philosophical terms in his descriptions here, and it's quite revealing of how his philosophy colored his scientific study. For instance, he opens the history of animals with this statement: "Of the parts of animals, some are simple." Now, that word simple is also incredibly important in philosophy, as is the opposing term with which it is often paired, composite. So something simple is, one, it has no parts. When you venture farther into philosophy and study things like being itself, as we will do here in a little bit, or if you get onto the topic of God, this word simple will return. More so, the use of terms such as this, like simple and composite, and many other terms which Aristotle defines, these terms also sort of help us to pin down the ideas that we study. For example, if we declare that God is simple, then he must be, according to most philosophic strains of thought, simple. Then certain attributes can be applied to him, and certain others, therefore, cannot. Once you describe something as simple, or as composite, or as cold, or as hot, or as white, or as red, you describe its essence in some way, you also limit it in another way. But there is genuine biological study and valuable scientific learning here in these treatises. Aristotle introduces us, for example, to the concepts of viviparity and oviparity, that is, animals which bear young alive and animals which bear their young in eggs, concepts which are still central to biology today. Furthermore, there is lengthy and minute description of each physical and behavioral detail about each animal, and he goes through in this encyclopedia of animals just about every animal that he must have ever seen or heard of in the Mediterranean region, including different types of birds and owls, snakes, crustaceans, and more. In this long, dense book, Aristotle classifies these creatures according to different characteristics: quadrupeds, bipeds, animals that crawl, animals that walk, that fly, animals with fur and without fur, and so on. You come across many curious passages in these pages as well, such as the following: Of animals which change their position, some move with the whole body at once, for example, jumping animals. Others move first one part and then the other. Now, this may seem like a school child trying to talk about animals, but you have to remember that Aristotle and all the scientists of his time relied entirely on observation. There was no scientific method, and there were no real instruments of study, such as the microscope. Genetics had not been discovered. So we must be forgiving if the biological treatises seem a little useless as modern biology texts. We want to hear about genetics, about biochemistry, about behavioral studies with decades of thorough observation behind them. But Aristotle was largely working off his own observations and those he had learned from others. No one was going out in the woods living off a university grant 10 years in the wild with a specific species of animal and composing scientific studies and collaborating with others doing the same. That kind of intense and fruitful study of the animal world just wasn't even possible until the last couple centuries. However, when I say that Aristotle relied on observation, this included dissection, and there is definitely a fascinating amount of detail about the organs of animals, even though Aristotle could not always be sure what certain organs did, because there was no chemistry back then, no knowledge of atoms, molecules, proteins, etc. Now, there are a number of other scientific and pseudo-scientific works in the Aristotelian corpus of writing. There are works on meteorology, on aging, on sleep, on the soul, and even on dreams and prophesying through dreams. As you must expect with ancient texts on science, there are things here that a modern person, even minimally educated, will consider to be crossing the line between science and religion. But these texts, they often cross another line, which I've mentioned before, that line between what we today consider strictly scientific and that which we consider strictly philosophical. A good example of this is Aristotle's physics. Aristotle's physics is not what you would expect from the title. This is not a science textbook in which you will learn equations like E equals mc squared, or you'll learn that force equals mass times acceleration. As I said before, the ancient Greek approach to science begins in philosophy, in logic, in thinking about causes and effects, and of course, in establishing our first principles. As Aristotle says in the opening of this book, we do not think that we know a thing until we are acquainted with its first principles. However, in general, it's a good practice in any field to do this, to define terms at the beginning of a text or a course, and so this is not that unusual. What first-time readers might find a bit more shocking is the way that Aristotle spends so much time in the beginning of this physics book on the topic of being. Now, English is not a great language to translate this concept into, this concept of being, possibly because it's also a noun in English, such as he is a human being, and because we also use the word as a verb and we use it casually, like when we say, I like being with you. Here the word being is suggesting some sort of physical proximity. But understand, when we talk about Aristotle and the quote-unquote concept of being, we are talking about the grand subject of existence. And you might say now, well, why don't we just say existence instead of being when we translate the Greek word used here? Well, it's not that simple. The Greek word used here in this text and many others, and which is sometimes translated as being, is the word ousia. O-U-S-I-A is one way to translate it or transliterate it into English. Remember, Greek has a different alphabet. And this is a word over which many religious struggles will be waged in centuries to come, when Christianity is just beginning to stand on its own 2 feet and theologians are trying to explain the Holy Trinity. There will be much more on that and on this term in the Roman and medieval series. Anyway, this Greek word, ousia, it doesn't simply mean exist. Online, you might see it translated by a non-philosophical source as something like property, but that will confuse the English reader as well, because when they say that, they don't mean property like a piece of land or something you own, but rather the property that something or someone might have, a characteristic, an adjective, like a white horse has the property of whiteness. But that's actually quite off as well, because really in philosophical parlance, ousia refers not to an adjective, not to a characteristic, but to a thing itself. Ousia speaks rather to the essence of something, its true being, having nothing to do with what it looks like or how it feels or it sounds. This is not an easy idea to get across, especially in modern times when we spend so little time thinking about our being, but are rather more caught up in the externals of our existence. And I suddenly have a great deal of sympathy for philosophy professors trying to get this across to their students. Now, I actually experienced something of this misunderstanding about the term being while growing up as an English-speaking Catholic. In the New Order of the Mass, which was developed in the 1960s, the Catholic Mass that I grew up with, there was a portion of the Nicene Creed, which is a litany of shared Christian beliefs, and we all recited together in the church that Jesus was, quote, begotten, not made, one in being with the Father. This was the old translation. They've since fixed this so that it works a little better. But anyway, the translators were trying to come up with a way to translate this concept into English, because in the original Greek, the word ousia is there in the creed. Recall that all Christian ideas are really best understood either in Greek or Latin, since those are the two primary languages in which its primary theological ideas were first stated. So the translators of the Mass were trying to say in English what the original Mass in Latin was trying to say here. Now, in Latin, the term used in the text of the Creed is consubstantia, or sharing the same substance. Remember, I mentioned that word substance before. Substantia was the word that the Latins used to translate this Greek term ousia, the same one that Aristotle is using here in discussing being. Now, myself, as a young man, hearing that Jesus was one in being with the Father, I just got the idea that Jesus and the Father hung out together. I'm not kidding. Whatever concept the translators were trying to get across to me was completely lost. What the Creed actually says in the original Greek is that the Son is homoousian to patri. Homo means same in ancient Greek, so homoousian to patri means that he has the same ousia as the Father. They share the same being, the same essence, or as the Latins decided to call it, the same substance. To risk further inaccuracy and possibly confuse you even more, one might say that the Father and Son are made of the same stuff, except that per Christian beliefs, neither one of them was ever made, but that's a theological discussion for an episode in a later series. Another example comes to mind. Imagine that you're on the beach and you walk out into the ocean. You have a cup in each hand. You dip the cups into the ocean and hold them up. The quantities of water in the two cups are separate. They are distinct, but they are also equal in a way because they share the same substance. But the ocean water, right? They're both made of the same thing, but these concepts of being and essence and substance and ousia are far beyond my capacity to teach you, and it's probably already obvious. I can only, I hope, spark interest in a very fundamental concept without which we really cannot venture into philosophy or even into science. You see, often when we study science today, there's a great focus on mechanical things, how things happen, causes, physical laws such as gravity or the forces which hold atoms together, or states of matter, gas, liquid, solid, plasma. We study science in order to know how to devise and make better computers, build bigger rockets, cure illnesses. And these are not bad purposes to have. But the ancient Greeks, they were interested in a much more fundamental question. How is any of this here? And I don't mean the creation story. Saying that God created the universe or Zeus did it or that it was always here does not answer this question. In fact, this is a question that both atheists and the religious can seek to take together, they can seek answers to, because I'm not asking you to tell me the events that led up to all this, to this universe around us. When I ask, how is any of this here, I want to know how we exist, the way in which we exist. Again, not asking the underlying physical mechanics of our existence, our hearts pumping blood or sperm and egg coming together in the womb. I'm not even asking about the events that led up to the appearance of the universe. I'm not referring to the Big Bang or anything, but I'm referring to the very nature of our being. our existence. And again, I'm throwing up my hands here. This is almost impossible for me to explain adequately in English anyway. I don't fluently speak or understand ancient Greek, so perhaps the question came across more intelligibly when Aristotle asked it. But come away from this understanding that the philosophers wanted to know before anything else, before wanting to know why fire is hot or why water runs downhill, they wanted to understand this concept, our very being, our ousia. Of course, Aristotle is also interested in the way that things came into being as well. He not only gives his own opinions on the matter, but also relates the parameters of the argument and the opinions of others. For instance, consider the following passage. The first of those who studied science were misled in their search for truth, and the nature of things by their inexperience, which as it were thrust them into another path. So they say that none of the things that are either comes to be or passes out of existence, because what comes to be must do so either from what is or from what is not, both of which are impossible. For what is cannot come to be, because it is already, and from what is not, nothing could have come to be, because something must be present as a substratum. So too they exaggerated the consequence of this, and went so far as to deny even the existence of a plurality of things, maintaining that only being itself is. So, while continuing to address the concept of being or substance or ousia, Aristotle also delves into the origins of things, the sequence of events that led to their appearance in the universe. And there is another fundamental question here, and a conundrum for thinkers of any time. In order for something to come to be, to come into existence, there must either be something prior to that from which it was made, or it must have come from nothing. But our reason tells us it's impossible for something to simply appear, to come from nothing, and yet, if some piece of matter was generated from something that existed prior to it, then that earlier something must have come from something else too. Eventually, you either have to go back to something originally appearing from nothing, or being made from nothing, or you have to accept that there has always eternally been some eternally existing substratum. You have to accept then that the matter making up everything has in some sense always existed. Eventually, this study will take Aristotle to develop an idea about a theory that we now often call the prime mover or the unmoved mover theory, referring to that being again, it's confusing to use that word in this regard, that being who must have originated all existence. And this one being, this mover, he has to be something immaterial, per Aristotle's argument. This mover must exist without parts, without size, be completely immaterial. Recall my earlier comments about the importance of simplicity, of being simple, having no parts. Understanding all of this not only requires great interest and great intellect, but as you can imagine, it also requires a thorough preparation in the first principles, in the definitions of terms, of understanding important philosophical words, such as substance, or another term that you should understand before we proceed with philosophy, the word accident, which we haven't discussed yet. Now relax, this one's a little easier to grasp. In philosophic terms, an accident is not something that happens inadvertently or causes some damage, like a car accident or I accidentally dropped the plate and broke it. No, an accident is sort of like an adjective that can be applied to a substance or an essence, but which does not change that thing essentially. An example, a man has the essence of a man. There is a certain substance involved in being a man. I don't mean to speak here about what masculinity is or he's a real man or something like that. I mean simply the essence of a human being, the substance which he or she shares with all other people. But a specific man might be tall or fat or black or white. These things, these descriptors, are accidents. They do not change the underlying substance of the thing that we are talking about, in this case, a man. A short man, a black man, a skinny man, they all have different accidents, but they all possess the same substance of being a man. Now, I can't sum up Aristotle's physics here or even elaborate sufficiently on its themes. I mentioned how the work of Aristotle is dense. You can take each sentence and derive meaning from it. Think about it, turn it over in your mind for hours or even days. People spend their careers trying to understand and then explain these things. The best thing that you can do is pick up a copy of Aristotle and dig into it yourself. In my curriculum series, the 12th series in this podcast, I have published some tools that you might find helpful if you go down this route and study Aristotle on your own. In the scientific treatises of Aristotle, we do find some purely scientific passages, even if we do not always agree with their conclusions. However, much of the text, as you've already seen, is mixed in with theories and ideas about matters which we are more comfortable calling philosophy these days. Now, in the coming episodes about Aristotle, we will look more closely at some of his more well-known contributions to true philosophy, such as his ethics and his metaphysics, as well as his ideas about literature, politics, and more. But until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.